I'll introduce the speaker in a minute, but I just wanted to mention that as per previous sessions, for those of you who've joined us previously, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to see or hear you. That said, we are very interested in your active participation and your questions, and so please do use the Q&A panel, which you can see at the bottom of Zoom on your homepage. So please do put forward your questions. If a question's already been posted, do vote that up, and what we'll do towards the end is take a selection of the most popular questions. So very keen on your feedback. We are also going to be live streaming this via YouTube, and then a recording will be available in due course. And towards the end, what I'll do is I'll share with you details of our forthcoming webinars. So let's move on to the next slide, please. So it's a great pleasure to introduce a wonderful colleague, Professor Igor Rudan, who's based here with us at the Usher Institute. Igor is co-director of our Centre for Global Health. He's also leads a WHO Collaborating Centre on Public Health Training, and is the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Global Health. And what Igor will be doing today is sharing with us experiences from Eastern Europe. And Igor's played a really important role there, working directly in partnership with the government to drive forward their responses. So Igor, a very warm welcome. I hope you're keeping well, and really looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Aziz, and thank you, colleagues, for coming and joining me to share my story about the Eastern European experience. And it's been a rather strange and unbelievable story, you'll see. So play from start. Okay, can you see it? Can you all see the first slide?
That's fine, yeah, Igor.
Okay. Okay, so thank you once again for joining. I'll try my best to go through this as quickly as possible to be able to answer as many of your questions. So you could have all seen that Eastern Europe didn't do badly at all, and may have wondered, why is this the case? Well, I think each country has its own story, and I'll tell you the story of Croatia, and this story of Croatia will involve also 5 more countries of former Yugoslavia. So this is how it happened there. I think you will see that a lot of things that I'm going to be telling you today will be very supportive of this Chinese proverb. There are many things which cannot be imagined, but there is nothing which may not happen. So where to start? In 2017, as I keep making trips back to Croatia regularly, my family lives there, my parents and so on. Whenever I'm there, I try to be useful. So in 2017, I decided to start writing popular science books to share with the population there, especially high school and students, the knowledge and understanding how to think about 21st century, because there's hardly been an education reform since 1969 in that area of the world. And the first one was The Exact Color of the Sky, the story of science. The second one was Evil Air, the story of medicine. That one brought the stories of more than 100 Nobel Prizes awarded for medicine. And the third one, In the Land of Plants, the story of adaptation. That's about adapting to challenges of the 21st century. Now, all of them went straight to #1, and they have been national #1 best-selling books for a number of weeks at the time. And then also I've developed this video YouTube series, Survival, the Story of Global Health, which is a 2-hour introduction to global health. And all these activities, my publishers told me that I have to have a Facebook or some social network profile. So I started blogging on Facebook and sharing some parts of the books or some ideas about this or that. And I gained about 30,000 followers there. So this was what happens between 2017 and 2020. Little by little, I was gathering some appreciation in media space in Croatia as a public intellectual, and basically I mean, the whole pandemic started off with me already being in that space as a recognized public intellectual. Now, as I made, as this year started, I've come under intense pressure to start writing about what's happening in Wuhan by many of my followers. So I said, okay, sure, why not? And I started with sharing the 4th episode of Survival, the story of global health, called Keeping Our Enemies Closer. This is a 20-minute overview of the history of pandemics and how they shaped the human population and the humanity as a whole. I recommend this watch to anyone because it's really fascinating how people have lived with not one COVID, but 25 COVIDs at the same time, and many of them even more deadly than this one, and they still survive to this day. Unfortunately, 9 out of maybe 10 humans species have not. Actually, we are the last one left. And then the second one was about Wuhan and really what is going on there. And I started looking into the evidence and sharing ideas about it. And then there were conspiracy theories flying out all over. So in the next 4 episodes of this series, I started debunking one by one the conspiracy theories. So firstly, that the Chinese space program had anything to do with it. Then which animal was it? Was it a snake? Was it this or that? Then was Bill Gates behind this and from the start to sell the vaccine? And finally, did it come from Wuhan lab or not? So I was looking into the evidence and trying to explain to people how to think about these things. So that was all happening within the 1st and the 12th of February. Now, I would like to tell you just a little bit about Croatia itself, because Croatia has far more history in public health than one may think of. We had this great man. His name was Andrija Štampar, and he was a distinguished scholar in the field of medicine, social medicine particularly. He was actually the president of the first World Health Assembly at which World Health Organization was founded. So that's how respected he was. So he left us something which we all in Zagreb, whoever graduated from medicine in Zagreb, he needed or she needed to know these 10 things in the middle of their sleep, which is the principles of fighting epidemics. So he said, I'm not going to read them all, but he said, it is more important to inform the people appropriately than to pass any law. And secondly, the most important thing is to prepare the ground and the right understanding about health issues in any given environment. Also, number 8, the issue of public health is of greater economic than humanitarian importance. That's something that people today in many countries don't seem to understand. And finally, the doctor should be a teacher of the nation. You see how all of these things are now completely valid. Also, we should know that in Croatia, the first quarantine was actually introduced in Croatia, in the city of Dubrovnik, and it lasted for 40 days for all the ships who wanted to enter the city walls of Dubrovnik. All the people from the ships needed to stay outside of the walls. There was a special place called Lazareti, where they kept the whole cruise of the ships for 40 days. And then also, azithromycin, probably the best-selling antibiotic in the world, was actually developed by a Croatian pharmaceutical company, Pliva, in 1970s. And actually, that was one of the drugs early on that has been given to most COVID cases, patients with severe forms of disease, to prevent bacterial superinfections. Now, on to 25th of February. 25th of February is the date when I usually return to Croatia for about 10 days, because that's the time around my birthday. And that's when I like to be with my friends and family. And usually it's just a relaxed 10-day trip every a year. But unbelievably, when I landed, my son picked me up and he said, the coronavirus just came to Croatia, and people just are completely panicking and panic buying everything, and just people went completely nuts. And because nobody really believed it would reach us by that time. You see, this was only what, a few months ago, a couple of months ago. So basically, then I thought, oh my goodness, they will realize that I'm here, because unwittingly I agreed to give a public talk, and not just anywhere. I agreed to give a public talk at the Edward Bernays University College for Communications on the value of information in the 21st century. And that was the very next day, on the 26th of February. So I knew that the media would realize that I've landed and giving a public talk, and that they will all show up there. But it was way worse than I could possibly imagine. We've hardly seen as much interest of Croatians in anything before, apart from the war and the World Cup in football. So it was just as bad, actually, if not worse. So I had to give 3 consecutive conferences for firstly for these televisions and for those televisions, and then eventually for all the journalists and answering their questions. You could see how many people came just to get some thoughts from me. What can this now mean for Croatia, and are we in a grave danger, and so on and so on. So it was very, very strange experience, obviously. And after those 3 conferences, I gave my lecture, and then after my lecture, I was basically hijacked by the Evening Herald, that is the most important national newspaper in Croatia, to film a 15-minute video interview, which they would share through social networks. And then, as later that day, I was all over the news, obviously, with short statements. Then after that, the video was shared for social networks, and it reached 1 million views by midnight already. So eventually it reached 3 million people. So this is just showing you what intense interest was in Croatia into this issue once they actually realized that the virus has entered their borders. It was just hardly, I mean, like nothing ever seen. And I found myself in the middle of it all without any preparation or anything. It was very unpleasant experience, actually. Then the next morning, I woke up and I had dozens and dozens of requests for interviews for many Croatian newspapers, TVs, and radio stations. I realized I cannot possibly respond to these requests and to begin to. So I just wrote a press release on Facebook, which detailed my best knowledge of the dangers from the novel coronavirus. I explained that we need to be careful and vigilant, but no one should really panic because it's not that dangerous, obviously. And I apologize for not being able to respond to them all. But I said, look, I'm only going to agree to 1 television interview, and I'm going to write 1 long read text with answering 20 questions on this, and that's what I can do in these 10 days while I'm here. Please leave me alone. Basically, I was really strange. So the next couple of days later, the biggest TV show in Croatia is Sunday at 2. That's when everyone's home and just had lunch. So that was watched by 30% of Croatia's population, and I made some predictions to Mr. Stankovic. He is the one who leads this show. So I said that case fatality rate or infection fatality rate, whatever it turns out to be more important, for the novel coronavirus should be around 0.5 to 1% from what I could gather from data from Wuhan at the time. It could potentially kill up to about 15,000 people in Croatia under realistic scenarios if we let it to spread freely. But I said that don't worry, we will be able to control it through firstly testing, tracing, isolating, because we're not a country which has so much travel exchange at this time. But we should be very careful because Croatia is a country like almost no other, which has 5 tourists per 1 Croatian entering the country throughout the year. So our tourism is enormously important for our economy. So I said at the summer time we should be very careful, but now it's going to be fine. So I also predicted that there should not be more than 100 to 500 dead after the first wave, and thank goodness all of those predictions still seem to be accurate, because I was really worried after a while with Italy going out of control. So I also, in the next few days, I also made predictions on my Facebook that the West may not respond as well as China and the East in general, because they do not really have much experience with such epidemics in living memory. In Western countries, really, the epidemiology of infectious diseases is almost like an archaic thing that you can study or be doing, because frankly, we haven't had some epidemics, flu we vaccinate against. Now even, the AIDS is treated by retrovirals, tuberculosis is vaccinated against and treated. So we don't really have some infectious disease emergencies and even infectious disease epidemiology started to become more into non-communicable diseases, simply because there's really not much out there to do. Even there is a vaccine against the cervical cancer now and so on. So that was one thing that happened. And I said that China and the East may emerge as better organized because they had SARS experience and MERS, and just generally as societies, they put the values of the society above the values of individuals, and that this is going to uncover all sorts of differences, cultural differences, economic system differences. This pandemic is going to uncover it all and show weaknesses in our systems globally and nationally as well. Globally, it will expose how dangerous it is to have hunger still, because it's not just about shutting down a few markets in China. Whatever, as long as you have 9 million people dying of hunger, you will have people eating anything, and you will be risking pandemic. And then as long as you have such inequality, you will not be able to withhold a month of quarantine, because people will start running out of money. And there's all sorts of other things. And of course, prevention is not profitable. So we could have been doing so much more in preventing infectious diseases or meteor strikes or something, but no one invests in it because it's not profitable. So, we're exposed as a humanity, but now nations are beginning to realize that they're also exposed as nations, because once everyone looks down, if you outsourced all your production, all your food, all your then you're in a big trouble. So these are some lessons that pandemics is already teaching us all. So as I was speaking about these things, the editors of Evening Herald asked me to start writing regular columns for them, because they said they can ensure far bigger reach than I can have from Facebook. And I said, okay, sure. So we had a dinner to drink over it. Then finally, on the 9th of March, before I left Croatia, I published a long read answering 20 confusing questions on the novel coronavirus. I chose this Index HR. It's the biggest online news portal for the whole former Yugoslavia, because I wanted to reach everyone in the former Yugoslavia. They can all understand Croatian. And you see, it had more than 10,700 shares. And I knew that if I reach everyone then in Croatia, then my further columns in Večernji, in Evening's Herald, would be read very widely. So then I returned to Edinburgh, and I chose to live pretty much like an astronaut, stockpiled food on a weekly basis. I for the first time in my life, I started checking expiry dates before eating. I've never done anything like it before. Diet consisting mainly of Coke and chocolate as usual. I do not exercise, so I can join any control group anywhere in the world, or for any study as a negative example. And I started thinking forward what is to come, and following all the literature on COVID to write these columns. So what were these columns really? They were very long reads that had a detailed set of suggestions to the general public about what to expect in the coming few days, and what would be the logical behaviors and measures to take. And also, I was writing detailed suggestions to professionals working in health system about what comes their way, and how should they respond, should they think of protection equipment, and how and where, and and then also the government, what is important for them to be doing at the same time. So and these were all very well-minded long reads, which were extremely detailed, explaining everything. And this was a typical appearance of the Evening Herald when I was writing my columns. They started already on the front page, and then they had another 2 or 3 pages after that with an explanation, because I knew that we needed to get our population on board for everything that we need to do. And this was the only way to keep them really well educated. And there was so much of so-called infodemia around with all sorts of rushed news and crazy explanations for various things that were happening, that my columns really stood out in all this space as the only thing that actually is logical, you can understand, explains everything to you, gives you good ideas why everything is happening. And I've hardly ever been wrong about anything. So people just started ignoring everything else and reading this. So in my columns, I stated that the assessment of each country's performance in dealing with the coronavirus crisis will be based on the following 5 questions. Actually, this is something which I wanted the government of Croatia to really understand. So firstly, how effectively did the first line of defense manage to prevent the free spread of coronavirus among the population, and for how long? Then once the first line of defense was broken and exponential spread of the virus began, how quickly and decisively was a strict quarantine measure activated? The third one, how closely did the population adhere to quarantine? Fourth, how fast and active was the state to mobilize its capacities and human resources, as well as creative and innovative solutions to develop a concrete plan for quarantining and coexistence with coronavirus as quickly for dequarantining, for exiting and coexistence as quickly as possible. And obviously this needs to include the empowerment of technological capabilities, human resources for virus testing, innovative ideas on social removal measures, use of technologies to understand human context and spread of viruses. And then finally, how effectively after quarantine has the state allowed its inhabitants to move into a relatively normal life and preserve their economy from collapse, which with permanent control over the spread of the virus. So those were the 5 steps against which each government in the world will eventually be held accountable for their response to this crisis. And I wanted the Croatian government to understand this even before at the very beginning. So as a result, they offered me to become a key advisor to the government of Croatia for COVID-19 response. And they started having a regular video conferences with me to share information and thoughts. So you see they're all sitting beings apart from each other, some wearing masks as well. This is the Prime Minister Plenković and the Finance and the Internal Affairs Minister and so on. And I also suggested that the Scientific Council should actually expand, and we should invite Josip Car from Singapore, Petra Klepac, a modeler of infectious diseases from London School, Nenad Ban from Zurich, Ozren Polasek, who is our former PhD student from Split, and Branko Kolaric, my former also PhD student from Zagreb. So they agreed and they expanded the Scientific Council. Now, on the 12th of March, this was one of my really key texts. It was entitled "Contrast is the Mother of Clarity." So it was first published on Facebook. You see it had 3,800 reactions and nearly 2,000 shares, and then as a column. So basically, I propose that nearly all EU and US governments have about 24 to 48 hours left to make a decision between a quarantine and saving the economy approach, which are 2 bad choices, really. And I explained the extreme of one and the extreme of other, and what could you expect to go badly wrong in each one of them. So I explained that some US and EU countries were wondering if they could gain a major advantage over China if they actually let the virus spread while people would get immunity. So the problem with such decision was a major uncertainty about what really was a case fatality rate, because in Italy by that time things started to look bleak. And it was almost like a movie-like script with time running out, and you either had to lock down or let it spread. And it was a really, really difficult call at the time. Now, from the 13th of 18th of March, Croatian government was in a very difficult situation over introducing lockdown measures. Everyone after my texts became publicly available, everyone started pressurizing the government into locking down immediately, because they were looking at Italy and they thought the same would happen to us. We're the first neighbor, basically. But this was the first time that someone told them, no, we can still save ourselves, actually, don't worry, but we need to lock down now. Now, Croatia is presiding the EU at the moment. So for the Prime Minister Plenković, it was a very difficult decision, because this is going against all the politics and the political rationale of the European Union to lock down the borders when we only had 19 infected in one day, while they had 5,800 in Italy and a few hundreds everywhere else, and they were not closing their borders. But under the pressure, he decided that he is going to go for safety and set a bad example as a president, and he just locked everything down. On the March 13th, he locked down the schools the day after my text. On 17th, all meeting points, all the bars, restaurants, everything. 22nd, he restricted movement between counties. And these violet lines are showing these events, and you can see how well we were before they actually, we were well down with the number of daily cases below in single digits still before we locked down. And you can see what happens even after you lock down, how bad it already is if you even had those few at the start. So the green line is the recovered ones, the red line is the dead, and the orange is the daily number of cases. Now, on the 19th of March, after we locked down, I teamed up with the famous Croatian online mathematics teacher, Toni Milun, to explain the exponential growth of new cases. And I inserted this in my columns. Toni is a great guy. He made phenomenal videos explaining to people how this exponential growth takes off. So on the 19th of March, when we really locked down completely, I developed a simple way to explain the need for quarantine. I just developed this table showing how week in, week out, it just goes times 10. And the human brain just does not understand exponential function. We're used to thinking in linear terms. So if you add something for 10 days in a row, the 10th day you think is going to be 1/10 of everything. But in exponential curve, whatever you added last day is 90%, and everything that happened before is 10%, and the human brain just can't grasp that. So in this way, I explained to everyone very clearly what's going to happen if they do not stay home. We were at day 21, so maybe around 1,000 infected already. EU were day 35, 100,000 infected. So 2 weeks difference means 100 times worse of a problem. So if Italy locked down 2 weeks earlier, they would have 100 times less dead. I mean, that's very difficult to understand for a brain, that 2 weeks can make such a difference. But unfortunately, that's what it is with this virus. So, and then what happened? We all got in our homes, and then the next day, earthquake hits Zagreb during a quarantine. And people had to go out, but they were not allowed to be out, but they were no longer allowed to be indoors either. And it was really strange. I mean, if I watched a movie where there is a pandemic and people are quarantined, and then the earthquake strikes and they can't either be in or out anymore. And it was a very hard earthquake. I mean, all the buildings in the center of the city got terribly, terribly damaged. All the roofs got damaged. You see the Zagreb Cathedral. What happened is that the cross from the top of one of these has fallen through the roof just in front of the office of the Archbishop, and he could not get out. And I mean, it's very difficult not to see it as some kind of a sign from above for him now, I think. And he's already not been thought of as a very good leader of the church anyway. So anyway, you can see that it's been terrible experience. People were already scared from the pandemic, and now they were scared from the earthquakes, and they were tremors constantly for a few more days. Now, total Croatia news. These are the British people in Croatia who are leading the website for all the UK tourists who visit Croatia. And it's phenomenally popular. It's read by hundreds of thousands of Brits. Paul Bradbury leads it, and Lauren Simmons is the editor. And they told to people, because they began to translate my columns, and they became popular even in the UK as nothing they've had before. So Paul Bradbury wrote this article because Jurgen Klopp, the manager of Liverpool, said, "Look, I don't know anything about epidemics. Just don't ask me what I think about it." And I was the one who knew something about it. And basically they were trying to send the message, listen, just be happy that we have someone who knows something, and everyone else, basically, please just stay quiet if you can. So, right. And then as a consequence of the earthquake, all the roofs got destroyed, and the bats that were living in the attics suddenly had to find another shelter. So they moved down a floor down to the ceilings of the people's flats. And this is Lauren asking if there's a bat protection society, because she has a cat and she's worried that the cat would be doing something bad to the bat. And I just told her to eat it and start the second pandemic on the top of this one, because in Zagreb at that point we were just really waiting for vampires and Godzilla as the next thing to happen to us. Now, thanks to Lauren's translation, we started publishing my articles on the Medium and offering them as a free course in pandemic to all these low and middle income countries, which are now to follow, and they're still behind. And this is still ongoing, but they have raised a lot of interest. I don't know if you know about Jeffrey Sachs, but Jeffrey Sachs wrote to me and said that these are really good, and he's going to try to find another medium for them in the United States political space, because he thinks that people in America need to understand what a disaster the response of the United States has been, and these texts could help a lot. So now we'll see what comes out of that. He's talking to Project Syndicate apparently, and their editors. Now, from 23rd to 27th of March, I identified the strategy, the hammer and the dance, as optimal for Croatia. That was on the Medium. Actually, as I was going to Medium, I realized there is a Medium article, the hammer and the dance, and I thought this was a very good way to think about this, and I arranged for my followers a Croatian translation and republication in Croatia. And then there is this Croatian famous musician who lives in New York, Nenad Bak, who is a peace campaigner, and we published in Journal of Global Health his calls to world peace a couple of years ago, but he was always ridiculed and he was always made fun of, yeah, right, there's going to be a world peace. So out of absolutely nowhere, in the middle of this pandemic and horror of the earthquake, comes him and says, brothers and sisters, world peace has come, and rejoice, hallelujah, basically. So he created quite a lot of amusement actually with that, but actually it was true. So after the hammer and the dance strategy, we had another scientific, we kept having these scientific councils, but they had to move into a new and modern building because the old premises were badly damaged in the earthquake. We discussed how best to implement the hammer and the dance, and made plans for greater testing capacity. And now everyone started talking about tourist season. Can we somehow save the tourist season, and what should we do to save it? Because we would be the safest country in the Mediterranean, really, if we play our cards right. Italy is still troubled, and Spain and France, and Portugal certainly. Greece is doing not badly, but Croatia could then become, the destination. Can we take any advantage of this situation, and how in the world should we do that? So this is just to show you how my columns fared. You see that they would typically have 282,000 views or something like that, or 240,000, and that's just online, and there were 200,000 further impressed. So I was reaching probably about 25% of adult Croatian population with these columns. They were really showing people what government is thinking, because I had a close link to them. So I could also, tell them, okay, we're going this way, this is why, and so on. So I was preparing the ground for people to accept in majority all the measures that we were planning. At the same time, as if I didn't have enough on my plate already, the Journal of Global Health has been bombarded with submissions on COVID-19, and we received more than 100 papers on COVID-19 in less than a month. And now we're running the collection, and we're trying to process them as fast as possible. But what we seem to be really popular for as a journal is for national level reports of what happened with COVID response in this country, in that country. We got everything from Timor-Leste to, Vietnam, to Iran, to Turkey, to anything, you name it, Peru. So now we are developing guidelines for preparing national level reports on COVID, and we hope to become a journal which is going to be known as a hub for these national level reports on COVID response. So that's something that we could not foresee, but requires additional effort and time. 1st to 8th of April was really the height of our This was the peak of successful management of the crisis in Croatia, really. You know, everything was working well. I was managing the population's expectations. I was telling the government what would be the good ideas. We were discussing everything with they were really listening to scientists at every step. And on the 8th of April, we had 1,000 confirmed cases, recorded 7 fatalities. This is entirely comparable with Singapore, Emirates, Qatar, New Zealand, Hong Kong at the time. So we were among 10 most successful nations in the world in our response. The key to our success to this point was that our first line of defense was really knew what they were doing. Their test, trace, isolate held so well that basically the average daily increase in the number of cases was 12% between March 3rd and 19th until we went into quarantine. And that was the best in the whole of EU. So already we were holding it off, although we had Italy just next to us, northern Italy, we were holding it off better than anyone else in Europe, even with the first line. And then we had timely lockdown. We didn't have a single incident in retirement homes, because that's something I said from the start, and I wrote in my columns: do not go to retirement homes. You may be responsible for 20 dead people. You know, is this what you want to live with? So, and hospital infections we had, but they were quite well handled, actually. So this was the peak of our performance, 8th of April, really. In the next week, we managed to finish successfully the digital assistant for coronavirus, because Croatia has quite a good IT sector, and everyone turned to solidarity, and people gave their staff to develop a digital assistant. We called it Andrea, of course, again, and it assesses a personal risk of being infected with COVID based on symptoms and provides advice how to respond to any indication of COVID infection. We set up drive-through testing facilities in all big towns, and so far we conducted 41,000 tests, which is exactly 10,000 per million to date. So not as much as some others, but we know our context so well that we don't feel that we need more than that. 17th to 26th of April was the 5th week of quarantine. During weeks 4 and 5 of lockdown, unfortunately, we could no longer hold the virus from breaking into retirement homes. We had 25% of them affected. Usually this happened through ambulance interventions when someone from the retirement home needed an urgent ambulance for some emergency. And then they would pick it up at the hospital and bring back into the home. That's how they got it, because we were really holding them off fantastically well up to that point. And then our number of casualties over 2 weeks jumped really from by today jumped to 78, but it's only, I mean, half of our deaths are in retirement homes. 27th to 30th of April, a number of my former students and PhD students on social networks started objecting to people becoming epidemiologists. We were joking that we usually have 4 million of football managers when we go to any competition. Now we have suddenly 4 million epidemiologists. Everyone's trying to pass their opinion and supporting it with analysis of some epidemiological curves. So we started analyzing the oil price curve just to show them how ridiculous they are being. And also Nature has called on scientists to not let misinformation unremarked. So we set up a team for exposing this misinformation and fake news, and it's really acting preventatively, because just by people on social networks being aware that this exists, they are now thinking 3 times before they post anything fraudulent. So on the 1st of, now we're getting closer to today, 1st of May, in my big column, I was summarizing what we discussed on the Scientific Council of the government. We were considering several exit strategies for Croatia. Should we actually, because we were doing so well, we were thinking, should we be going for complete virus suppression? That would require perhaps 2 more weeks of quarantine, but that would be a disastrous thing for our economy. So this is a desirable solution if it's realistic, and requires a quarantine early, a prolonged high level of discipline, a strong economy that can withstand the quarantine, but also geographical location that facilitates the future surveillance on virus. So what we were hoping, perhaps, we were discussing, could we become a corona-free zone together with Slovenia and Montenegro and Bosnia, because they were all doing well, and Macedonia, and also Slovakia? And could we just use those six, could we start forming corona-free zones in Europe, like in the war when you have free territory? Could we set up corona-free territories and then just freely have tourism only with those countries? So that was one thing we were considering, but we realized that we concluded that we cannot do that because it would be impossible for us to not have a virus reintroduced. So we just decided to cut the quarantine short. Now we were thinking, should we go for a stronger first line of defense as a long-term strategy? But people in Croatia rejected the idea of surveillance, of GPS stuff, just really were against it. And then we realized we cannot rely on this. So now we are resorting to just loosening and tightening and relying on the population to be vigilant and keep their distance. But I've developed also and proposed the fourth one, which is based on liberalization of personal risk management, because it may be much more efficient to just allow everyone to do whatever they want, but with that signal to our headquarters what people actually are doing. And then they can calibrate the measures, and then they could send the signal back to the population what is the state of infection, and then people could modify their behaviors. So maybe for this trust with the population, we can get there. So what is the situation now? Croatia, 2,000 confirmed cases, 85 dead, 14 critical. Slovenia similarly, Bosnia similarly, Montenegro even better. When I posted that post, contrast is the mother of clarity, the Montenegro liked the idea of radical quarantine early on so much that they thought that we may actually become the first corona-free zone, and they locked down immediately. And you can see even those few days are making a big difference. Serbia was the only one that didn't want to listen to a Croat, so they now have what they have, but now they are actually translating all my columns immediately, and they have 3 or 4 big newspapers there who are immediately publishing them. And North Macedonia, again, the same. So basically, by locking Croatia, we locked down also Bosnia and Montenegro pretty much because they all their travel routes come through Croatia. So all of this really, I mean, a lot of this has been done through cooperation of these countries and agreeing to the same strategies. Where are we now? Here, you can see these tiny dots in former Yugoslavia in comparison to even Romania, Hungary, and Austria. And Slovakia, you see, is doing really well as well. We thought of united front of corona-free Europe, but you can see how much better that is than what's happening, unfortunately, in the Western Europe when the first line of defense was broken and epidemics spread without anyone realizing it and locking down. So how did the rest of Eastern Europe respond? Well, I guess they all had more knowledge of epidemiology of infectious diseases because of the army duty. You know, under communism, they had army duty, and in army duty, you would pay a lot of attention. Croatia also had a war, and that helped us, the recent experience with infectious disease epidemics. So I think that whole mindset of army duty and military epidemiology has helped Eastern Europe to understand far better than the Western what's going on and how dangerous that may be. And I guess each of these countries had their own pioneer their own front runner who was aware of this and directing things. Now, based on all these writings, I got a lot of interest to write books now on and to publish these columns as books. So already there are 2 in preparation. The Quarantine of Wuhan is covering the period from January to mid-March until the lockdown, and Quarantine Croatia from mid-March to mid-May, and they will be sold in all these countries because now I have about 3 million people who are reading my columns in various forms. So that's been this remarkable story, and I am happy to answer any of your questions. Hello.
Okay, so Igor, thanks very much indeed. Fascinating overview of your experiences in Croatia, and also some very interesting insights into Eastern Europe, and many congratulations on the really important successes there. So maybe, Igor, I could just kick off and just ask you, I mean, you know the UK context very well. So your thoughts on how the UK has done so far? Well, I mean, I think I'm pretty clear, I know what your answer will be. But what should the UK be doing at this moment in time? I'd be really interested in your thoughts.
Well, I don't know how to say this nicely, but we may realize over time that the UK's response may have been the very worst in the world, possibly. I mean, let's hope not, but it's really not been to this first wave. It's really not been good, unfortunately. I don't know why is this. We can, once this is all over, maybe we can sit down and look into week after week. But clearly they did not understand how quickly this is spreading based on the Italy experience, and the lockdown did not happen nearly as soon as it should have, and now we are left with with what we are left with. But I have to say that although this Croatia story looks great for now, that does not mean that it is a good story. This is one of the two bad things that can happen to you, and you know, one of the two bad choices. And we've suppressed the virus as much as possible quickly, but our economy is going to suffer catastrophically. The virus is still there. People are now going out. I'm not sure they fully understand that the virus is there, and it only takes 2 or 3 weeks to become 10,000 or times more of a problem. And I'm worried. I'm genuinely worried that we may have a second wave much sooner than we think. And at that time, if that happens during the tourist season, our economy is just going to crash completely. And we have no idea. On our scientific meetings, we have no idea what to do. Honestly, this is my honest, sharing. We are really worried. We have now done well. We have gotten big loans for Croatia to even go through these 5-6 weeks and help all the businesses not to go bust. But 50% of businesses would have gone bust by now in Croatia, or even only after 6 weeks. I don't need to tell you what this means. And if we have the second wave and we don't get our tourist season, which I don't know what's going to happen, honestly, that country is going to be in a huge economic trouble. So we did save lives initially, but this is not over yet. And if I'm telling this to you for Croatia, then what this means for Britain, where you need to wait. I mean, I was looking yesterday, we had like 6,000 new cases, 600 deaths. We're nowhere near crashing the curve in the UK. We may need another 9 weeks at least, and we're already been in this situation for 6 at least, right? So, I mean, what a disaster. And not just that, but even after that, even after we crash the curve and have spent 13, 14 weeks in a lockdown, what then? I mean, I don't know. I don't know. This is just dangerous enough so you can't ignore it, but then not dangerous enough to stop the whole world. And at some point, I don't know what's going to have to happen.
Okay, so thanks, Igor. So there's some questions that have come in. Let me take a couple of these. So one is from Anthony Chutter, and his question is around how long do you think it is before we can return to normal in the UK? And there's a related question, and that is around, there's a key decision coming from UK ministers in the next few days around lockdown measures, and your thoughts on whether these should be lifted or maintained.
I wrote a very, very long column for with this in mind. I started looking at examples where we are tolerating human deaths in order to save the economy. So the whole car industry, I was looking at the number of people who die in car crashes. I was looking at the number of people who die of smoking. So we're clearly tolerating millions of deaths in order to save the tobacco industry and the car industry. Otherwise, we would say, like, we don't want cars, we don't want smoking because they kill people. Coronavirus kill people as well. And then people would say, yes, but it's your own decision whether you want to drive a car or whether you want to smoke. It's not your decision to get the coronavirus. But then I said, okay, but even in the car accidents, there are always some completely innocent pedestrians or passengers in the car who it was not their decision to be there. And also, even with smoking, there is 1 million deaths in the world of passive smoking, and we're not, preventing them by stopping smoking. So I started playing with numbers, and I think that what we are tolerating as a death to save economy is $1 million to $10 million in economy to tolerate one human death. So I think the temporary solution until there is a drug or a vaccine, I honestly believe is going to be in a liberalization and in a human right to get infected with coronavirus. Because, human rights are just constructs of the human brain, and they become rights when enough people stand behind them and fight for them. So at some point, people will get tired of this, because we cannot stay in quarantine forever, because we're all going to die of hunger instead of only 1 or 2% or 3% of people dying of coronavirus. So clearly, at some point, people will just stop listening to anything government says. And I think it's better to avoid that situation by just giving everyone the right to do whatever they think is wise to them in view of their personal risk. There's even people 85 plus who are saying, I don't want to be sitting at home. If I have 85% chance of surviving infection, I want to be using my 85% chance. I don't want to die after spending 2 years of my last years of my life locked in. So I'd rather take my chances. So, I think there is going to be over time just a movement towards allowing people to do whatever they want anyway, and then whoever dies, just as it's with the traffic accidents. I don't see anything else until we get the vaccine and the drug.
Okay, I'm going to take a question from India next, and this is from Subhash, and he's saying that in India there's limited testing capability, very densely populated areas. The number of cases so far is relatively low. It sounds at 53,000 today. Do you have any thoughts as to why is the case?
Yes, I do, absolutely. So I think that Africa, India, Southeast Asia, all of those countries, I think they're ill prepared for this epidemic. And I know this because I have read and reviewed about 20 papers from all sorts of places recently, and they're all saying the same thing. There is all sorts of fake news, there is no testing capability, and basically the whole problem is probably developing but going unnoticed. Now, the only thing why it's not far more apparent in those places is because this really does affect very old people in terms of death. And the average age of people dying is 80, 81, 70. In Croatia is 79 and so on. So basically, in India, in Africa, the only fortune in this misfortune is that they just simply don't have many people who are that old who would be massively exposed as they were in northern Italy. So what may happen is that the virus is spreading very fast in India and in Africa. No one knows about it, but it doesn't matter because vast majority of these cases are asymptomatic or have milder symptoms and so on and so on, whereas the deaths would have happened in very old people who are not there simply. So I think there's going to be a very peculiar pattern we see in low and middle income, in low income countries and even middle income countries. So okay. I think they're almost protected from this with their age structure.
There's a few more questions, so maybe I'll ask you to be relatively brief, Igor.
Yeah, sure.
The next one is,
Aziz, I lost you, unfortunately. Could you please repeat it? I lost you.
Yeah, okay.
Now I hear you. Hello? Hello?
Yeah,
you're breaking up, but I'll try to understand, okay?
So the next question is around BCG vaccination, and yes. To what extent is that protective in an Eastern European context?
Look, I really don't know what to say because I don't think it should be. But on the other hand, you know how in medicine things work? Sometimes you see some peculiar things coming together and they turn out for some way that you never thought of to really be true. I really don't think I think that someone made up a story looking at the map. That's such a weak ecologic epidemiological reasoning. There sure would be terrible things happening in Croatia and everywhere else if we didn't lock down early. So the difference is really due to lockdown. It's not due to BCG. Whether it protects or not, I don't think so, but I'm not going to say absolutely not, because you just never know.
Okay, so there's a question from John Frank, and this is around airborne transmission. And clearly the WHO guidance initially was it's all droplets and contacts, but there is emerging evidence around airborne transmission. And do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, I think that we're in trouble with this virus as long as we don't understand how it really spreads, because we don't. And I mean, we do now. There's still quite a lot of uncertainty around this, but airborne transmission makes some sense, because it looks like now when they're doing detective work of the exact surroundings where when they're tracing the contacts and when they're looking backwards in how anyone got infected from anyone else. I mean, familial spreads within family is extremely prevalent, and also spread within the confined spaces seems to be prevailing as a mode of spread, which does probably suggest that there is airborne transmission too. And but I don't know. I mean, I haven't done the study myself, so I'm only as smart as anyone else reading these new studies.
Okay, and maybe just a final question, and this comes from Lawrence Gruer, and Lawrence's question is that the UK government is repeatedly saying it's relying on the scientific experts. So is your thoughts, is what the scientists were saying wrong, or was the government not listening? Do you have any thoughts on this?
I think that, I mean, from what I could gather, I think that they thought that they had more options than they really had. I think that they really thought that they could play a game with this virus in some way, that they had options, that they could time it, that they could do this or that they could, if they needed a quarantine, they could move it when they wanted to have it, which is in the colder period of the year rather than earlier on. So I think they thought that they had more options than this virus really lets you have, because they completely misunderstood how quickly it spreads. And that's the key feature of this virus, which tells us all and reminds us all that in epidemiology of and epidemics, it is far more important how quickly and efficiently it spreads than what is the case fatality rate. With Ebola, it was 50%, with the MERS 30, with SARS 10, but it didn't spread this efficiently. This one has 0.5 or 1%, but spreads crazily fast, and look what's doing to us. So I just think they thought they had more options, and I think that also they put far too much weight on what some psychologists and not that I have anything against any psychology, but what people from behavioral sciences were saying about epidemic, rather than the epidemiologists themselves. So the behavioral scientists were making the whole of the narrative about are people going to want to stay in the quarantine or not? Are people want to listen that they should just do whatever and not go home? So basically, you had two bad choices. If you tell them quarantine, they're going to start saying no after a while. If you say don't quarantine, they're going to say no when they see people dying and actually quarantine, self-quarantine. So there was far too much worrying about people will not listen to either of the advices. So how do we play that, rather than actually looking at the biology of the virus and epidemiological parameters and realizing that you just don't have options at all. You can only shut yourself down quickly, have as few cases as possible, get over it, and then while you're locked in, think through what to do next. But that doesn't mean that that's eventually going to be much better, unfortunately. So the only reason I'm not terribly critical of the UK is because simply we may all end up eventually in this situation for a very long time, because who knows where we'll get vaccine or a drug. Let's hope we get them soon. But I can't guarantee that, and nobody else can either.
Yeah, no, amen to that. So Igor, thanks very much indeed. There's lots of positive comments coming in around fantastic leadership here and in enormous service to your country and the region. So thank you very much indeed for joining us. That's been absolutely fantastic.
Thank
There are
you.
a few outstanding questions, so we'll send those across to you, Igor. And if you wouldn't mind answering those, that would be helpful.
Please send it to my email, and I will very, very happily answer them.
Good. So finally, can I just thank our Russia comms team? So that's Jess, Linda, Susan, and Laura, and also Linda Bald, who's been helping convene these webinars. Enormous thank you. There's a lot of work that goes into those. And we just wanted to alert you to some forthcoming events. So Vietnam has done absolutely fantastically as well in comparison with many other countries. So we're going to be hearing from Vietnam next. And then we're going to be having a focus on tobacco with colleagues from the UK and India. And then we've also got one forthcoming, and that's on the 27th of May, and we'll be learning about experiences from Italy. So thank you again, colleagues, for joining.